What happened in the last 2 weeks of 1941 that shook the world to its core? World War II had, thus far, been devastating. France had fallen, as had most of Europe. Britain was holding on by a thread, and the Soviets under Stalin had been betrayed by Hitler. Thousands of miles away, isolationist American politicians watched on with distant interest, keen to preserve themselves without getting entangled in European affairs. This bleak outlook could have led to the annihilation of democracy. However, the fortnight from December 16th to 31 brought significant events which would eventually lead to the defeats of fascism, Nazism, and the Japanese Empire. Come with us and delve into World War II's defining moments at the close of 1941. The world at war. When December 16, 1941 came around, it had been over 2 years since the Nazis had invaded Poland, prompting Britain to declare war and the Second World War to officially commence. Much of Europe had fallen, including the Dutch, the Belgians, the Czechs, the Austrians, and most alarmingly, the French. Only the British, isolated and protected by the ocean, remained stubbornly opposed to the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Having signed the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, the three aggressors had vowed to protect each other if a fellow member were attacked. In December 1941, this agreement would come into play. For most of the year, things had been going badly for Britain and her empire. However, with Hitler's attention suddenly diverting to his treasonous invasion of Russia in June 1941, they received a welcome break from the Blitz and began regaining their strength. More manpower was desperately needed. But where would it come from? In December 1941, Britain got the answer. Help came in the form of the United States of America. Japan had always considered the U.S. its greatest threat. With naval bases like Pearl Harbor situated to cement control over the Pacific, any imperial Japanese expansion could be challenged. The nation didn't have the resources or expertise to take on the American might head-to-head. For this reason, the decision was made to strike at Pearl Harbor preemptively. They aimed to wound the American Pacific Fleet deeply enough to seize control of the Pacific. At this point in World War II, things were changing rapidly and on a daily basis. After Pearl Harbor and the Japanese declaration of war, the American policy of isolationism had been put to one side. The people were outraged at the audacity of Japan's attack and had witnessed the brutality of the Axis powers firsthand for the first time. The U.S., along with Britain, had declared war back on Japan. A few days later, Hitler, apparently without consulting his advisors, declared war on the Americans, siding with his Japanese ally even though the Tripartite Pact meant he didn't technically have to. The U.S. would undoubtedly have joined the war in Europe anyway, but it's still seen as one of Hitler's biggest blunders. America's vast resources were now mobilizing. Roosevelt was preparing to take the fight to the Japanese after reinforcing the British and Russians and retaking occupied Europe. America mobilizes. Although the states had not formally joined the war before December 1941, thanks to isolationist movements, it had supplied Britain and her allies for some time. In late 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had called on the Americans to become the arsenal of democracy, and the people had responded. In the late 1930s, America was still reeling and recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment was still as high as around 15%. The war effort spurred jobs into overdrive, and by 1944, unemployment dropped to just 1.4%. The factories built to produce cars switched to building guns, engines, military vehicles, planes, and anything else that might positively impact Britain's precarious position in the war. And so, when December 1941 came around, and the U.S. was formally at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy, the transition from a peacetime economy had already begun. The average American worker, therefore, actually benefited from the war. President Roosevelt laid the foundation for these advances. Without his leadership, it would have taken much longer for the U.S. to join the war, which in turn could have led to even more substantial consequences. He was among the few to support Churchill and Britain in their darkest hour, manipulating policies and finding loopholes to ensure that America's closest ally got as much aid as possible. In contrast, many American politicians, worried about their own economic depression and hesitantly looking back at the severe losses suffered in the First World War, favored an isolationist policy. They had a strong navy and military, but it wasn't the superpower it is today. They wanted to leave Europe to fight amongst themselves. Roosevelt was one of the few to recognize from the get-go that should fascism prevail in Europe and East Asia, the Americans would suffer regardless. On the 7th of December, after hearing about the attack on Pearl Harbor and correctly concluding that the U.S. would now join the war, Winston Churchill apparently said, "We should not be wiped out. Our history would not come to an end. We might not even have to die as individuals. Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. All the rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming force." Days after America joined the war effort, Churchill boarded a boat, the HMS Duke of York, and sailed across to Washington, D.C. He arrived for a December 22nd conference and, on December 26th, addressed a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress. He was reinforcing the Europe First policy, the idea that the true backbone of the threat lay in Nazi Germany, not Japan. Defeating Hitler first was imperative, as if the USSR and Britain fell, Europe would become a mighty and virtually impenetrable fortress into which the US would have few possible angles of attack. But if Europe was taken first, Japan's supplies would be cut off, and they would be next. Britain and the US agreed to implement offensive strategies in Europe as soon as possible, while maintaining a temporary defensive strategy in the Pacific. Once Germany fell, the Japanese threat could be wiped out. On December 30th, Churchill traveled to Canada to address the Canadian Parliament. He mocked what he called Hitler and his Nazi gang and assured the Canadians of Britain's resolve in the face of terrible odds. Despite the unrest, they would not be moved. The Axis powers' response. With the last weeks of 1941 seeing Germany, Italy, and Japan all officially at war with the U.S., approaches and tactics changed. Would the three tripartite pact countries unite? Well, not really. As one of the earlier signs of his growing nervousness, Hitler seized complete control of the German army on December 19th. Much the same attitude followed toward Mussolini in Italy, who was essentially nothing more than Hitler's puppet, and the Japanese. The Germans sent a few limited resources Japan's way, but they mostly left them alone, in part thanks to conflicting interests in China. By declaring war on the U.S. along with the Japanese, Hitler may have hoped to weaken their forces by splitting their front in two. Some troops would go to East Asia, while the rest would join the European and North African fight. The German and Italian commanders, particularly those fighting in the deserts and oases of northern Africa, must have started preparing for an eventual American invasion. During this period, Rommel had been forced into retreat. It wouldn't be his last, and he would counterattack viciously effectively in January 1942, but it was the first chink in the armor. Most worryingly, from an American and British perspective, devastating U-boat attacks became more common. The German subs swarmed the east coast of North America, sinking cargo ships and fuel tankers as soon as they left port, often within visible distance of the shoreline. The U.S. government censored as much information about this as possible to safeguard the idea that their Navy could effectively protect most cargo vessels. In fact, The Germans were well aware that the true threat from America stemmed from its industrial capabilities and ability to resupply Britain with food, fuel, materials, equipment, and troops. By targeting the shipping, they sought to interrupt this supply chain. However, the main development from December 16th to 31 was the continuation of the Japanese Empire's plan to expand and basically seize the entire West Pacific. Pearl Harbor was just one of many advances the Japanese made that day. But seizing all this territory and its resources meant keeping the might of the Americans far away. It was imperative that the U.S. Navy couldn't attack with their full force. In fact, on December 7th, the same day, by U.S. time, as Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had landed in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong as preliminary footholds in their missions to capture these regions: the Philippines, Thailand, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Cutting America off from these locations meant seizing strategic island ports in Wake Island, Guam, and the Gilbert Islands, as well as crippling Pearl Harbor. Guam and 3 of the Gilbert Islands had quickly fallen to Japanese control. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, the same day Japan began its assault on Burma. The first vessels from the Pearl Harbor attack fleet returned to Japan on December 24th. Hong Kong fell on the 25th. The Japanese were making quick and effective strides in their plan to seize vast swaths of territory. However, the Pearl Harbor attack had awoken the sleeping giant. It had failed to sink any American aircraft carriers. They were all out at sea. The giant was very much awake, barely scratched, and at the end of 1941 was preparing to come for them with a vengeance. The home fronts. With the declaration of war, the last weeks of 1941 also saw things changing on the American home front. Rationing had been in place for years in other countries like Great Britain, and plans were drawn up for the same to happen in the U.S., although ration cards wouldn't be dished out until May 1942. On December 19th, the U.S. Office of Censorship was put into place. Its job was propaganda and information censorship, ensuring safety and maintaining civilian morale. It was on the home front where America shone, after all, with its vast capacity for massive amounts of material production and supplies. In the U.S., far from the war-torn countries of occupied Europe or Britain, morale was high. Public opinion had always been against Japan, and the Pearl Harbor attack enraged the vast majority of the population in Congress. Yet to experience any significant losses, Pearl Harbor aside, and with much of the reporting on the war in Europe coming through selective newspapers and radio broadcasts, isolationism turned into a country itching to get involved in the fight. Nowhere is this more evident than in the military numbers. In 1940, the American Army, Navy, and Marines comprised 458,000 troops. This number had swelled to 1.8 million by the end of December 1941, setting the stage for 1942. So, what impact did the events of the last weeks of 1941 have on the following year? Well, the declaration of war between the States and Germany would set the scene for 1942 and indeed the rest of World War II. Despite their huge numbers, the American military was remarkably green in December 1941. It had not seen large-scale conflicts since the First World War, and the armies it was joining and fighting against had already been at war for over 2 years. Because of this steep learning curve, American naval losses, especially as a result of U-boats, were far higher than many expected during much of 1942, considering they were barely involved in any fighting. But the training improved as the years went on. The fleets learned how to repel U-boats more effectively. Soldiers settled in Britain and learned about the dangers they were facing. Marines on the Pacific Front became more familiar with Imperial Japanese culture and the severity of the threat facing them. Production lines on the home front stepped up their output. The beast had been prodded, and now it was angry, but controlled. The Europe First policy held despite the patriotic rage felt by the American population, and over the following years, it was executed successfully. It would be a long and arduous slog ahead, but a vital part of the defeat of fascism. These events set a course that would define the progression of the war. The Axis powers reeled from the American reaction to the Japanese assault. They put on a united front, but ultimately, if Japan had left America alone, they likely wouldn't have gotten involved. The Allies wouldn't have had the manpower and supplies brought by the Americans, and history may have looked very different. In just 2 weeks, the world was irrevocably changed. These events set a course that would define a generation. Are you interested in more content like this? If so, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to ensure you stay up to date with all our in-depth historical content.